Are we on?
Yeah.
Hello, well, welcome. Thank you very much for coming to this webinar. I'm Professor Alex Watson of the History Department at Goldsmiths. We're running this series of A-level webinars and YouTube videos in order to make up for, or at least in order to help make up for, some of the problems that the pandemic caused, some of the lost teaching, and also as well to give year 12 and 13 students at schools and sixth forms a taste of what teaching at higher education is like. We also want to advertise ourselves. We've got a great department, so if you do enjoy this webinar or any of our other offerings, we're running these right across the autumn, then please do check out our history degrees. We'll put the links to our web pages up on the chat later. But I just want to say now that we're extremely proud of our teaching. We offer exciting creative programs which tackle topics that other places really don't, and we offer students a global choice, and we're situated in the world's culture capital, London. So please do give us a look. I've already introduced myself. I'm going to introduce my colleague Rachel, who is running this webinar for us today. She's a departmental marketing officer. She's helped us hugely, and she's also a Goldsmiths graduate. So Rachel, do you just want to say hi?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending. And if you've got any questions at the end, please post them in the chat, and I will ask them at the end of the lecture.
So Rachel, as she said, will ask any questions you have. You've got a chat function on your Zoom. So the way that we're going to organise this webinar is I'll give you a talk for 40 minutes. By all means, post questions while I'm talking. Rachel will gather them and she'll ask them. And in the Q&A as well, feel free to post more questions. And I'm really looking forward to what you come up with. I'm going to switch over now to the presentation that I've organised for you. And as you will all know today, I'm going to talk about Weimar's bitter poison. Did World War I doom democracy in Germany? And I want to begin by thinking about the Weimar Republic itself, about why it's such an exciting topic to study. Of course, it's one of the staples on the A-level curriculum, but it's one of the most fascinating places, one of the most fascinating times in European history. And I think that there's two reasons for this. I think one is that Weimar is a society of contradictions. It's a society where there is the maximum democracy. Weimar Germany from 1918 to 1933 is probably the most democratic state in the world at its time. It's a place of extraordinary creativity in the arts, in architecture, in so many other different areas. And it's also a place of, by contemporary European standards, extraordinary liberal tolerance. And yet, all of this sits alongside another face of Weimar, alongside authoritarianism, alongside rising anti-Semitism, and alongside near permanent crisis. I think it's that juxtaposition, that mix of the most democratic state in the world with rising authoritarianism, rising prejudice that makes this so fascinating. Of course, the other reason why Weimar is fascinating is that it seems to offer a possibility to a different history, a window to what could have been, avoided. Because of course, as you all know, Weimar precedes the Nazis. It's the fall of Weimar that opens up Hitler's Third Reich and all the evils that came with that: persecution, war, and genocide. Older historiography on Weimar presented this as a state doomed to collapse, a state where the odds were simply stacked against it. There's historians of the 1980s embraced, some of them anyway, embraced the so-called Sonderweg thesis, the special path thesis. The idea that really a very democratic Germany never had a chance because German liberals had failed in 1848 and 1871, and they would fail again. Other historians have emphasized flaws, fatal flaws in Weimar's constitution, the sheer extent of democracy in a state which had only experienced partial democracy before, key flaws in the writing of the basic laws, like Article 1848, the emergency law, which opened a way to authoritarianism in the early 30s. Others again have argued that the problem with Weimar was in 1918, lay in 1918, with the incomplete revolution. If only, these historians say, the far left had triumphed, if only the more moderate left, the Social Democrats, hadn't put down the Spartakists and the KPD, the Communist Party, with such force, then there would have been a real possibility of a progressive coalition which would have kept Weimar going. But of course that didn't happen, and the chance of it happening, according to this older historiography, was slim. By contrast, more recent writing in the last 2 decades or so on Weimar Germany has presented us with a rather different image of this republic. More modern historians, or more recent historians, stress that this is a dynamic republic, a determined republic, a republic which succeeds against the odds from 1918 to 1923 in overcoming extraordinary turbulence, economic devastation, and massive violence as well, to achieve some modicum, some sense of stability and some grounding in the second half of the 1920s. And this more recent research particularly emphasizes the role of the Great Depression, the collapse, the economic collapse of October 1929, and the subsequent massive unemployment, massive hit to gross domestic product, massive hit to the economy of a light which even we in this pandemic find difficult to imagine. And they argue that it's this that ended Weimar. What I want to do today is suggest a different thesis. Rather than emphasize the Great Depression of October 1929 and the early 30s, I want to go back to the First World War. And I want to argue that the First World War really did lay the foundation for Weimar's disaster, Weimar's ultimate fall. One can see this, I think, if rather than putting Germany in the context of the Great Depression, one puts it in different contexts. It's important to remember that 1929 and the economic catastrophe, which was global, didn't cause authoritarianism right across the world. It didn't even cause authoritarianism right across Europe. There were plenty of regimes, plenty of states which survived and which endured. France had a longer recession than Germany, but didn't descend into authoritarianism. The UK suffered serious recession and depression in 1930, but didn't. And as for the USA, well, unemployment and economic drops in the USA were even greater than they were in Germany. And yet that maintained its democratic system. So the economic crisis of 29 was severe, there's no question about that. And I wouldn't deny either that it plays a key part in bringing about the fall of Germany's first democratic state. But in and of itself, it's not enough to explain it. In fact, it's better, I think, and more useful to think of Germany, to put Germany in a different context, in the context of Central Europe. And think about Germany as a Central European state, a state where, which was part of a series of states which had lost the First World War, which had collapsed in the First World War, which had been defeated in the First World War. This area that I've got on the display now shows what was interwar Europe. And in this interwar Europe, previous to 1918, there had been 3 great empires: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire to its southeast, and the Russian Empire to its east. And all of these states, what these states have in common is 2 things. All of these states experienced, as parts of these empires, all of these peoples experienced as parts of these empires that collapsed in 1918, defeat and trauma. And subsequent to 1918, they experienced massive violence. On top of that, this was a very multi-ethnic region. And there was massive ethnic hatreds as well in this area. And it's no coincidence that tied to all of this, the other thing, as well as that experience of defeat and ethnic defeat in the First World War and ethnic conflict in the immediate aftermath, that ties all of these countries together, and class conflict as well. The other thing that ties them together is authoritarianism and dictatorship. Through this region, there was hardly a state which survived the interwar period as a democracy. They start out as democracies, but they collapse. And Germany is by no means the last to collapse at all. In fact, Poland, Lithuania, Yugoslavia, and Italy all turn into authoritarian dictatorships before Germany does. But Romania, Bulgaria, and others, Latvia, lose their democracies only afterwards. Could be argued, of course, that Italy is the outlier here, because Italy was actually on the winning side in the First World War, but Italy is a bit of an exception, because although it was on the winning side, the consensus in Italy, and especially among the elites, was that the sacrifice hadn't been worth it, that though Italy had won the war, it had lost the peace. So the same mentalities of defeat that covered Germany, Austria, Hungary, and these other areas also embrace Italy too. And I think this map is revealing in showing that rather than thinking about the Great Depression, we need to go back. We need to think first about the First World War, because what these countries share in common is that experience of defeat in the First World War and of ethnic and class violence afterwards. So to understand Weimar's collapse, it helps to put it in this Central European context. And of course, we can understand the importance of the First World War. We see the importance of the First World War to Germans and Germany in the immediate aftermath as well, because for most people, I think, living in Germany through the 20s and into the early 30s, the First World War of 14 to 18 was a war that never really ended. The sacrifices that Germans had made in that conflict, the first total conflict the world had seen, were extraordinary. 2 million people, 2 million men, in fact, had died in this war. And worse, not only died, but had died for a lost cause, because of course, Germany was defeated. As well as the 2 million dead, there were huge numbers of still living human wreckage living in Germany in the 20s. 533,000 war widows, more than 1 million war orphans. And all of these people were people who needed supporting, as were men who had fought in the army, had survived, but had been crippled by their war service. In 1928, the German state is spending 1.35 thousand million Reichsmarks simply on supporting victims of the war. That's 18% of the total budget. This is a huge, huge, huge economic burden for this post-war state. And many other states in the surroundings had similar burdens too. To focus only on the economic burden the war left, though, would be a mistake. Arguably even more important is the psychological burden that this awful war left. The Versailles Treaty, which ended the war, was perceived right across the political spectrum in Germany as an immense humiliation on all sorts of levels. Article 231 of the Versailles Treaty, it was a very, very long treaty, was particularly potent at causing widespread resentment. This was the so-called war guilt clause, which forced Germany to accept, in conjunction with its allies, the entire responsibility and to accept blame for the damages done in the war. This, of course, was a legal necessity because it paved the way for reparations. Germany lost a huge amount of treaty as a result of defeat in the First World War. So it lost a huge amount of territory. It lost 13% of its territory and 10% of its pre-war population. Much of this pre-war population weren't ethnic Germans. Many of them were Poles, some of them were French. But nonetheless, there were a lot of Germans in these lost lands. And many of them returned in the 5 years after the war's end. Some 500,000, maybe even more Germans who had suddenly found themselves trapped in another country when the borders changed, came back pretty impoverished and very resentful to Germany. And this was deeply felt. These losses, this humiliation was deeply felt. If you take a look at the map on the screen, this was a map which was issued by the German government. It's not a far-right map. It's issued by the German government for school use in 1928. And its title is Germany's Mutilation. Awful and powerful image of the body of the state actually being torn apart by the war and by defeat. And then the sore was constantly returned to. The pain was constantly come back to due to reparations. Reparations, of course, were monetary compensation for the damages that Germany was blamed for inflicting on Belgium, on France, on Britain. And these were enormous. In 1921, when they were set, Germany was told to pay 132 billion gold marks. And when it failed to do so, the French and the Belgians invaded the Ruhr, the west of Germany, in 1923. It didn't stop there either. The Germans resumed paying. There were continual negotiations through the 1920s. The Dawes Plan of 1924 set a different repayment plan. The Young Plan reduced the overall payment, but ordered Germans to pay until 1928. That was in 1929. So these losses never really went out of public view. The bitterness of having to pay for a lost war, and the memory of the huge sacrifices continued again and again and again, and were constantly part of the Weimar Republic's political agenda. Now, of course, and as you'll all know, I'm not the first person to notice the importance of the First World War for Weimar. There's a legion of works written on Weimar Germany, and there are some very important ones written on the impact of the First World War as well. Three that I want to bring to your attention here. Fallen Soldiers by George L. Mosse, that's published in 1990, and Germany After the First World War by Richard Bessel, published in 1993. And these two books particularly focus on the front generation, on the Western Front, on the soldiers who served in the army during the First World War, who faced the awfulness of the industrial warfare of 1914 to 18. And these two books look at the legacies, at the values, at the cultures that they brought back to Weimar Germany with them, to a peacetime society which never really managed to enter peace at all. The third book by Antti Mäkelligot, Rethinking the Weimar Republic, is more recent. It's 2014, and that offers a different view. It casts Weimar as suffering from a crisis of authority and authoritarianism. And Elligot sees that as beginning in the First World War, the weakness of the state, which was to beset Weimar right through its existence, through the whole 15 years that it survived. Actually, he argues, began before, during the war, under the strains of total war in 1916, when the army and Germany's parliament start competing for authority. And he sees that conflict between democracy and authoritarianism actually stemming out of this epoch-making conflict, and inherited and exacerbated by conditions in the Weimar Republic. It's the front generation, the generation that fought, that is the generation of men that fought, that has attracted the most interest, and for good reason. Firstly, there were huge numbers of them. Through the German army between 1914 to 18, there were around 13.4 million soldiers who served. 86% of all German men between the ages of 18 and 50 in the war years. Just simply colossal, difficult to imagine a society mobilizing at that level. Some 11 million survived to return to Weimar. And they're important for two reasons. The first is their sheer numbers. They were influential. They were 25% of the electorate in the 1920s. So they had considerable considerable voting weight. But more than that, their influence came simply not merely from their numbers. And it's important to emphasize that not all front generation ex-soldiers fought in the same way. These were actually a very diverse bunch. But nonetheless, their influence came from the prestige that they held in society. Germany had, as I think I've hopefully made clear, mobilized and sacrificed an immense amount to win the war of 1914 to 18, and it had lost. And the most pressing question for Weimar through its period was not simply how do we feed people, how do we give people jobs, but it was also how do you explain to people 2 million soldiers dead? How do you justify that when the war they fought has been lost? How do you commemorate war, a lost war? How do you help people, help families who've been ripped apart, internalize that grief, come to terms with those huge losses for nothing? And society's answer was to put military sacrifice on a pedestal, to emphasize sacrifice as a good in its own right, as a virtue in its own right. And for former combatants, of course, it was in their material interest to do this because they could make the point, and they did right through the 1920s and 30s, that we sacrificed for Germany, therefore we deserve a disproportionate share of this impoverished state's resources. We deserve jobs, we deserve housing, we deserve support. Now, Moss's book, the first one that I showed you in my previous slide, argued that these soldiers brought back with them from the violence of the Western Front a new, brutal political culture. And from Moss's work came what's often known as the brutalization thesis among historians. And it's the idea that the industrial warfare, the viciousness, the violence, the bloodshed of those years, 1914 to 18, had a permanent impact in radicalizing combatants. And that radicalization didn't stop in 1918, but when those combatants returned, they carried it with them. And it's this, Mosse suggested, that explains Weimar's brutal political culture, the very serious fighting of the early 1920s, and then the brutal street fighting and the paramilitary type organizations, political organizations that we see on both the far left and the far right in the second half of the 1920s and the early 30s. And there's truth in this, there's clearly some truth in this. For a body of veterans, it's clear that the experience of war did cause radicalization, a love of violence, a reluctance to go back to civilian peaceful norms, a denial that that was even possible. The strongest evidence for this are the groups known as the Freikorps, the Free Corps, who fought in the early 1920s. And these were volunteer soldiers, mainly far right wing, who nonetheless, for pragmatic purposes, served the new democratic government in order to suppress uprisings from the left in 1919 and 1920. And there were significant numbers. There was somewhere between 250,000 and 400,000 men who served in these Freikorps. What makes these Freikorps even more interesting and gives us a link from the First World War through to Hitler's regime is that many of these Freikorps then go on and take up important roles in Hitler's Nazi party, and particular in its paramilitary organization, the Sturmabteilung, the SA, also known as the brown shirts because of the uniforms that they wore. So these Freikorps act as the link between the brutalization of the First World War and Hitler's brutal paramilitary forces and brutal regime of the 1930s. And yet there are problems. There are big problems with the brutalization thesis. And Bessel, the second author that I showed you, points these out very clearly. The first is that the Freikorps were a small minority, a very small minority. Some 11 million German men came back from the front, and most likely only around 250,000, maybe a bit more than that, served in these Freikorps. More than that, many of these Freikorps weren't actually former combatants at all. They were students and youths who had just missed serving in the First World War by virtue of the fact that they weren't old enough. The biggest post-war, so biggest 1920s organisation for veterans was not any far-right organisation or even conservative veterans organisation. It was a group known as the Reich Association of War-Disabled War Veterans and War Dependents, which in 1922 had some 800,000 members. And this was categorically anti-war. So the idea that men are brutalized by the conflict and they return to enact far-right military policies doesn't really seem to hold true for the vast, vast majority of the war. Experiences were very different. The legacy of this was complicated. For some, for sure, particularly for young former officers, perhaps, but for the vast majority of men, it's difficult to argue that the front generation was a radical pro-war generation. In fact, the evidence indicates strongly that most came out of the experience of 14 to 18 anti-war. So what I want to suggest in this talk is that we need to go beyond this historiography, focusing on this front generation, influential though they were in all sorts of ways, and think about the multiplicity of experiences in this total war of 1918. And think about not simply the key tropes of the literature that I've shown you of brutalization and of violence and of authoritarianism, but also take seriously the trope or the theme of suffering, of German suffering in the First World War, and think about how that subsequently impacted on German politics and on Germans' inability to finally psychologically end this war and embrace peace. Before I do that, I think it's just worth emphasizing that the Nazis made a big thing about being the party of the front soldier. And you can see that from these election posters from 1932. This one in the middle, workers of brain and brawn vote for the front soldier Hitler, or the one on the left, front soldier votes for Hitler, or the other one, front soldiers, German men and women. Note, that's a very interesting thing. Note that front soldiers are put in a different category from normal men and women. They're special, they're different. Give the answer, Hitler for president. The Nazis characterized themselves as the party of the front generation. It makes this front generation very, very important. And yet everyone experienced the First World War. It wasn't possible to stand outside it, whether you were a young man of military age, a young woman, a very old individual, or a small child. This was a total war. Everybody was affected. And we need to think, to understand the war's legacy, about how Germans themselves understood this conflict. Of course, the story that most historians tell of the First World War, which is entirely true, or is certainly a valid interpretation, is that Germany played at least a major part, and some historians say was key to instigating the First World War. They argue quite rightly that it invaded Belgium and France in 1914. They also argue and show how the Germans radicalized the conflict and committed many, many war crimes right through it in occupation zones, both in the East and the West, and on the high seas with unrestricted submarine warfare. They argue that Germany, through the war, developed ambitions for control of the whole of Europe, a grasp for world power. And they show that in 1918, Germany planned to control the whole of Eastern Europe and create a huge empire there. And all of this is true. But Germans told a different story, which also had some truths in it, although it was selective. Germans in the early 1920s told a story of suffering intermixed with heroism. They told a story of how in July 1914, the Russians had mobilized first. The Russian army had mobilized first, threatening an invasion of Germany and forcing Germany to go to war. And the Russians did mobilize first, that's true. The German army mobilized in response. They told a story of invasion. The Russian army invaded Germany in August 1914, something that's not often mentioned in the literature, but for Germans at the time, it was earth-shattering. The part of Germany that was invaded was this part I've shaded in red on the map, a province called East Prussia. And this had Russian troops in it between August 1914 right up until March 1915. The Russian invasions caused some 800,000 refugees, many of whom spread right across Germany, bringing stories of horror of Russian invasion and atrocities and occupation with them. And indeed, the Russians did commit war crimes in East Prussia when they invaded. Some 1,500 German civilians were murdered by Russian troops during those invasions. And of course, these invasions were critically important for Hindenburg's right. Hindenburg is massively important in the First World War. Of course, he becomes the leader of Germany's war effort from 1916 when he takes over as chief of the general staff. And of course, he's crucially important for Weimar as well. He's the president of Weimar from 1925 right up until his death in 1934. He's the man who appoints Hitler as chancellor in 1933. And his story, his rise to prominence, starts with this invasion in 1914. It was Hindenburg and his sidekick Ludendorff who eventually saw off the Russians and won Germany's big victory at Tannenberg. The Germans had other grievances as well. Though Article 231 of the Versailles Treaty emphasized the destruction Germany had done, Germans felt themselves that they had good reasons to be aggrieved, and they felt rightly that war crimes had been perpetrated against them. The one thing that once the war was underway did more to radicalize it than any was not any German action, but a British action. The British in November 1914, very early in the war, declared the entire North Sea a war zone. They blockade Central Europe and ban international shipping from entering the whole North Sea. Nothing like that had ever happened before. It was illegal by maritime international law at the time. It was clearly a crime against international law. And it played a part in causing massive malnutrition and starvation in Germany in the middle years of the war. And Germans were at first apocalyptic about this. An influential tract written by a professor. Professors were really intellectual, were really influential at that time, rather more perhaps than we are today. Told the public that the British plan to seal the Reich hermetically from the rest of the world and vanquish our people through hunger. The English gentleman, this is from 1915, does not disdain to use violence against women and children. Now he wants to use the tested means of fighting, of starvation, in the absolute greatest measure, and ideally make of all Germany a single concentration camp. Of course, concentration camp at that time didn't mean what we imagine today. The concentration and extermination camps of the Nazis. When we think of concentration camps, those are what we look back to. But even in 1915, this was terrifying language. What this professor was looking back to was the concentration camps of the Boer War in South Africa, which the British Army had set up, and in which 28,000 South African civilians had died. So the idea that the British had the capability of making the entire of Germany a concentration camp was terrifying for Germans. And it resulted in massive hardship. It wasn't simply the British blockade that did this. There's huge German mismanagement of food resources as well. But by the summer of 1917, official German rations for civilians are down to 1,100 calories, which is less than half what adults need in order to function in everyday life. Nutritionalists say that adults should have around 2,500, but the official German ration by summer of 1917 could only supply 1,100. Germans had to queue for their food, and by queue, I mean queues that are unimaginable to us. Even at the start of the pandemic, if you think about the queues for toilet paper and food, awful though they were, it doesn't compare to what Germans went through in 1917 and 1918. Queues in Germany would begin overnight. In order to get food, you would have to start queuing at 10 o'clock at night in the big cities like Berlin. And small children would stand in the queues to hold their parents' places, with families swapping through the night. And if you arrived later than about 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning, then by the time you got to the front of the queue, the food would be gone. Huge suffering. And this suffering affected civilians above all, not German soldiers, not the front generation. Soldiers were reasonably well fed, but civilians above all. And no one was more affected than children. I think we should need to think much more about children's suffering in the First World War. And I'm drawing on work by an American historian here, as well as my own, a man named Andrew Donson, who has written particularly about war pedagogy, so what German children were taught about in the First World War. German children were malnourished in the First World War. By 1918, boys were 2.5 centimetres shorter than they had been before the war on average, and girls were 2.8 centimetres, nearly 3 centimetres shorter. The suffering was so bad that it was only in 1924 that international organisations, charitable organisations, ceased their operations in Germany. Before that point, organisations like the Quakers and others opened kitchens up like the one I've got on the screen now in order to feed deeply malnourished German children. The malnourishment came out of, in the first instance, the wartime experiences of total mobilisation and blockade. The blockade continued even in 1919, up until the Germans signed the Versailles Treaty. In order to force the Germans to sign that treaty, Lloyd George in March 1919 worried that the Allies, by keeping this blockade going even after the armistice had been signed, were setting a precedent, were setting up, were generating hatred among this younger generation for the future. And this younger generation suffered physically more and were humiliated more than anyone else in Germany, certainly more than the front generation in terms of their feelings of humiliation. We can combine that, though, to understand how they perceived that by thinking about what they were taught in schools and their war pedagogy, how they were educated. Because, of course, it could have been that this international goodwill after the First World War, when Germany remained impoverished, when there was hyperinflation, could have turned attitudes around and created gratitude to the international community, such as it was. But it didn't. And I think we can understand that by looking at what these children were taught. War pedagogy emphasized particularly the glory of Germany. It was ultra-nationalistic. Protestant middle-class German children in particular were keen to volunteer for the war effort. They took part in all sorts of war fundraising activities. They took part in patriotic youth companies and drilled over the weekends and took part in military exercise. And they bought nationalistic penny dreadfuls, which are cheap, small books, which told violent stories of German soldiers committing vicious violence in order to win the war for Germany. So when Lloyd George in March 1918 said the Allies were sowing hatred for the future, they were piling up agony not for the Germans but for themselves, this combination of suffering among this younger generation and violently nationalistic wartime education proved a potent mix. And these children, of course, saw the German army coming home in 1918, dressed as if they were victors, with garlands around their helmets, marching in firm, disciplined order. And they believed the stab in the back theory, the stab in the back legend, the idea that the German army had been victorious on the Western Front, that it could have beaten the Allies had it not been for left-wing, communist, traitorous working classes, Jews and other radicals betraying them. And this myth, and it was a myth, the German army was defeated on the Western Front in 1918, but right-wingers found these prejudiced, anti-Semitic, anti-left stereotypes very useful right through the 1920s to undermine the Weimar regime. These children, like the ones in this picture, more than any others, saw and believed. And it was these children people born between 1900 and 1908, so not the front generation born between 1880 and 1900, who actually saw the Western Front, who saw the violence, and who in many cases became pacifist, or at least anti-war. But this next generation of 1900 to 1908, who experienced starvation and malnutrition, and who went through nationalistic wartime pedagogy, it was this group, not the front generation, who in fact more than any other embraced the Nazis. By 1933, the Nazi Party had issued around 1.5 million membership cards. It didn't have 1.5 million members. People joined and then left the Nazi Party. And around somewhere between 40 and 50% of those members came from this generation who had been just too young to serve in the war, the generation of 1900 to 1908. And it was these men who, in relatively large numbers, joined the Freikorps, and it was these men who, in much larger numbers, joined the Nazi Party and its paramilitary organizations, which allowed them to enact their masculine fantasies of violence and of military glory in the early 1930s. So I'm going to finish up now and say that, just by conclusion, that in answer to the question, did the First World War doom Germany? Well, historians are always a bit worried about the word doom, about the idea of that something is preordained. But I think we can certainly say that the trauma of the First World War and Germany's inability to overcome it certainly meant that the Weimar Republic was on very unstable foundations and probably would have descended at some point into authoritarianism, even if not necessarily Hitler. I think in order to understand that, we need to think about the First World War in its entirety. We need to think about the front generation and its influence and the stories that were told about it. But we also need to go beyond that and recognize that it was a total war. We need to think about the suffering of the war, as well as the brutalization, the violence, and the authoritarianism that came out of it. And we need to take German wartime suffering seriously. And we need to take other generations beyond the front generation seriously, particularly the youth who saw the deprivation and who embraced the myths of Germany's nationalistic, militaristic glory and paved the way for Nazi radicalism and the Nazi regime of 33. I'm going to open the floor to questions now. Rachel's going to read them out. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that was interesting and you found it helpful. I'm really keen to see how you respond and what you've taken from it, what you've got to ask.
Hello, Alex. So the first question is, can you tell us a bit more about the stab in the back legend? What was it and why was it important?
Yeah, so the stab in the back legend is, it already started during the First World War, but it really came to prominence in the immediate aftermath of 1918, and defeat in 1918. So already during the First World War, the military high command had a tendency to present front soldiers as strong and dedicated and loyal and conservative and demanding total victory and uncompromising victory, and contrast that with a weak, effeminate, it was always put in gendered terms, and masculine soldiers and a feminine home front, weak, effeminate, potentially traitorous civilians at home who were undermining the soldiers. And whenever anything went wrong, there was always a bit of a sense of the German high command always tended to use that to excuse itself. Now, in 1918, when Germany was defeated on the Western Front, these stories of weak civilians and strong German soldiers, loyal German soldiers, went into overdrive, and they were given further encouragement by the fact that there was a revolution in the immediate, just before the armistice broke out, and that civilian leaders did request peace. What was never mentioned by the military was, of course, that the military had told civilian leaders to request peace, and then quickly the military denied all responsibility, and military leaders kind of went into the shadows and let Weimar's new democratic leaders take the blame. And that political maneuvering by the military elite, and ironically, German democratic politicians' frankly heroic willingness to take control of a lost war to try and save what could be saved for Germany, was used as a stick to beat German democracy by far-right wingers and by conservatives who never became reconciled to the Republic right through the 1920s. Judges often believed it, other elites believed it. There were plenty of teachers and university academics who embraced it to undermine the Republic. And it made psychologically, it made an important contribution to undermining Weimar's legitimacy.
So the next question, Alex, is how serious were the threats to the Weimar Republic in the early 1920s, and could it have fallen earlier?
So the threats were really serious. And in fact, some of the most recent historiography argues and uses, partly convincingly, I think, the fact that Weimar overcame the threats of the 20s as evidence of its strength, that it wasn't so weak. It certainly wasn't doomed to collapse by the First World War, even if ultimately it had key foundational weaknesses. This is their argument. And the challenges were huge. The violence of the early 1920s was much, much greater than in the late 1930s, before Hitler took power. There was actual almost civil war. There was civil war, there were left-wing uprisings, there were right-wing uprisings, like the Kapp Putsch, like Hitler's 1923 Beerholt Putsch. There was hyperinflation, so economic crisis. There was invasion by foreign powers, by the French in 1923 of the Ruhr. And yet somehow Weimar overcame this. And I think that this modern historiography that emphasizes that the skill and the strength that Weimar had to do that, I think it's right to do that. But of course, the problem was that there were still nonetheless these underlying weaknesses. And the crises of the first part of the 1920s lasted so long and was so intense that the few years of peace and comparative economic stability in the second half of the 1920s, and of course these were built on unstable foundations, they weren't really long enough to give Weimar another chance before the economic depression kicks off. And of course the depression of 1929 is so bad in Germany, not least because of the impoverishment caused by the First World War. So we end up in a kind of circle where it does go back to the First World War again.
And the next question is, did having Hindenburg as president on balance strengthen or weaken the Republic?
And that's an interesting question. So Hindenburg is a very complicated figure. He was a general, he presents himself as a huge patriot, and yet as well as being a general, already in 1914, when he comes to prominence by defeating the first Russian invasion of East Prussia, he's an incredibly skillful self-publicist. He becomes very, very prominent. He becomes the symbol of the German war effort. And in 1925, when he's asked to be president, he says he's reluctant, but he will do so for Germany's good. And I think we can kind of argue this both ways. On one hand, having a figure like Hindenburg, who was very widely respected right across the political spectrum, as president, you could argue in 1925, actually helped cement Weimar legitimacy among some groups, that it did help get people's acceptance of this new democratic regime if someone like Hindenburg, conservative though he was able to play a part in this system. However, as a lot of both old and more recent historiography argues, Hindenburg was himself, and argues rightly, Hindenburg himself was not a committed Democrat. And he and his acolytes play a key part in using the power that he has as president to undermine and ultimately end democracy in the early 1930s. At first, he refuses to appoint Hitler as chancellor, but even so, he's still willing to use Article 48, the emergency powers, in order to undermine German democracy in order to remove the power of the Reichstag. How serious that was, how appropriate or otherwise his use of that is, there is some debate on that. But as an uncommitted Democrat, as someone who wasn't committed to democracy, as someone a general who had authoritarian sympathies at the very least, he wasn't a firm figurehead for Weimar at the very least, and ultimately he played a major role in undermining it.
Thank you, Alex. And the final question is, how damaging was Gustav Stresemann's death in 1929 for the survival of Weimar?
So Stresemann comes up a lot that's also interesting. Stresemann comes up a lot in the literature because he was such a pillar, unlike Hindenburg, of the Weimar system. He was a right-wing politician, a moderate right-wing politician. He had actually been in favor of annexations, so of Germany getting lots of land and conquering lots of places during the war. But he was also a pragmatist, and he realized that the democracy had possibilities, that it offered hope for reintegrating Germany into the international community. He was briefly chancellor. He played a major role, though, his major role above all as foreign minister, and also in ending the inflation, or helping to end the inflation of 1923. And he died in October 1929, just as the Wall Street crash was about to happen. And yes, I think that his death did seriously damage Weimar. On the other hand, though, I think the response that one can make to that is, if Weimar's survival was so contingent on one individual, then I think that we have to again look back to the foundational problems that the First World War brought with it for this regime as being ultimately unsurmountable.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And that's all the questions that we have on the chat.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you very much for all of you for coming and listening. I hope it was useful. By all means, if you've got any questions, if they come up later, do drop me a line. My email address we'll post in the chat function. You can also find it on our website. And if you have enjoyed this seminar, then please do take a look at the Goldsmiths History Department's websites. We really have fantastic creative degrees, and we're really keen to meet you. And if you're interested in applying, then do drop me a line at historyadmissions@gold.ac.uk. I hope very much to see you at subsequent seminars, and good luck for the rest of the term.